When people look at the UFC today, sold-out arenas, global superstars, billion-dollar deals, it's easy to forget how unlikely its success actually was. Because the UFC didn't start as a sport people respected, it barely even started as a sport people accepted.
They're really, really bright guys. It's very technical.
Well, anyone who gets into a cage for a living, you start questioning, right away.
In fact, at the beginning, many people genuinely believed the UFC wouldn't survive at all.
Lou, what do you think of UFC?
I'm not a big fan.
And honestly, they had a good reason to think this. When the UFC first appeared in 1993, it wasn't trying to be polished, regulated, or mainstream. It was raw. It was chaotic. And it was designed around a single controversial question: which martial art works best in a real fight? No weight classes, no time limits, minimal rules, styles versus styles, boxer versus wrestler, karate versus jiu-jitsu. Everything felt experimental and dangerous. That novelty helped the UFC gain attention early, but it also created its biggest problem. People didn't see it as a sport. They saw it as violence.
Exactly that way. What Ultimate Fighting is it's in a cage, it's in an octagon, and it's like a combination of boxing and wrestling.
The minute you say it's in a cage, you lose people's respect.
Politicians called it human cockfighting. Several US states banned it outright. Major cable companies refused to air it on television. Sponsors wanted nothing to do with it. At one point, the UFC was available in fewer than 10 states. This wasn't just a rough patch, it was an existential crisis. The UFC's early challenge wasn't competition, it was legitimacy. Without rules, regulation, or athletic commissions backing it, the UFC had no future as a major sport. And for a while, it looked as though it might disappear entirely.
You're a fucking idiot.
Pay-per-view numbers were falling. Public pressure was rising.
Ultimate Fighting, you can do whatever you want.
Not anymore. No, it's not exactly that way.
And the brand had become toxic in the eyes of mainstream Americans. And then came the turning point. In 2001, the UFC was purchased by Zuffa, led by Dana White and the Ferretta brothers. This is where the entire trajectory of the sport changed.
For UFC 30, tonight signifies a new beginning, with new leadership, with great vision.
Instead of leaning into the chaos, they did the opposite. They added weight classes, round and time limits, unified rules, athletic commission oversight. They didn't just clean the UFC up, they built it as a real sport. And this part matters, because it is easy to forget the UFC didn't grow because it was brutal, it grew because it became professional. Even with rule changes though, the UFC still was not mainstream. It was surviving, but not thriving. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected place: reality television. In 2005, The Ultimate Fighter debuted, and at the time, this was a massive gamble. The UFC paid to put the show on television. No guarantee of success, no guarantee anyone would care. But what the show did brilliantly was something no other combat sport had done before.
16 of the country's best unsigned mixed martial arts fighters are about to get the opportunity of a lifetime.
Many fighters dream of someday fighting in the UFC. 2 of you actually will.
It made fans emotionally invested in the fighters before they were stars. Viewers didn't just see fights. They saw personalities, struggles, backgrounds. And when the finale ended with Forrest Griffin vs. Stephen Bonnaire, a chaotic, unforgettable fight, the UFC finally broke through. That moment didn't just save the company, it launched it. Pay-per-views surged, gym filled with new MMA fighters. The UFC went from a niche to national, and then international. From there, growth started to compound. Stars emerged. Chuck Liddell, George St. Pierre, Anderson Silva, Brock Lesnar. Each one brought in a different audience. And by the late 2000s and the early 2010s, the UFC wasn't just surviving anymore, it was expanding aggressively. International events, global scouting, multiple weight divisions. women's MMA entering the mainstream. And this is where the UFC separated itself from boxing in a major way. Boxing revolved around promoters and individual fighters. The UFC revolved around the brand. Fighters came and went, but the UFC logo stayed dominant. Fast forward to today, and the UFC is no longer fighting for legitimacy. It is the premier MMA organization in the world. The UFC holds events in over 25 countries, reaching hundreds of millions of fans, and in 2016, they sold for $4 billion, one of the largest sales in sports history at the time. Today, UFC events routinely draw over 1 million pay-per-view buys for major cards, tens of millions of social media interactions, global broadcast deals across ESPN, BT Sport, and international networks. In terms of digital reach, the UFC consistently outperforms leagues that have existed for a century. And this is where the comparison to other major sports gets really interesting. When we compare the UFC to leagues like the NFL, NBA, English Premier League, or even Formula One, the UFC operates very differently, but competes surprisingly well in key areas. The NFL dominates in revenue, bringing in over $18 billion annually, far more than the UFC. But the NFL is regionally concentrated, with most of its audience in North America. The UFC, on the other hand, is inherently global. The NBA has massive international reach and star power, but the UFC has something unique: individual stars from dozens of countries all competing under one banner. The Premier League draws the highest average viewership worldwide, but it relies on club loyalty. The UFC relies on personal connection. Fans follow fighters, not teams. In terms of social media engagement per athlete, UFC fighters often rival or exceed stars from traditional leagues. A single UFC star can generate more engagement than entire teams in other sports.
The one, the only, the notorious Conor McGregor!
And unlike boxing, where belts are fragmented and champions rarely fight each other, the UFC consistently makes the biggest fights possible. And that matters. But it hasn't all been smooth sailing. One of the biggest criticisms the UFC faces today is fighter pay. Compared to revenue-sharing models in leagues like the NFL and NBA, where athletes receive roughly 48 to 50% of the league's revenue, UFC fighters receive significantly less. This has sparked ongoing debates about unionization, contracts, and long-term fighter health. The UFC structure allowed it to grow quickly and maintain control, but it also creates tension between the promotion and the athletes who fuel it.
You're a fucking idiot.
That tension may define the UFC's next chapter. So where does the UFC stand today? It's no longer an outsider. It's no longer controversial for existing. It's no longer fighting for airtime.
Ultimate Fighting Championship.
The UFC is now one of the most influential sport brands on the planet. It has global reach, cultural relevance, young audiences, and digital dominance. And perhaps, most importantly, it represents the future of how sports are consumed. Short clips, viral moments, individual personalities. In many ways, the UFC feels closer to modern entertainment than traditional sports, and that might be its greatest advantage. The UFC story isn't just about fighting. It's about adaptation, rebranding, survival. It's about how something once rejected by society reshaped itself into a global sport without losing its identity. And whether you love it, hate it, or fall somewhere in between, one thing is undeniable. The UFC didn't just join the sports world. It forced the sports world to change. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you see the UFC as a true peer to the world's biggest sports, or something entirely different? And as always, thank you for watching.